to our August seminar, Conversations of Social Reproduction. And we're really delighted today to welcome Dr. Panchali Ray, who is an associate professor in anthropology and gender studies at Kriya University. And she's the author of Politics of Precarity, Gendered Subjects and the Healthcare Industry in Contemporary Kolkata, which was published by Oxford University Press in 2019. So we're really delighted to welcome Dr. Ray, and she will speak for about 25 minutes or so, and then we will open up for Q&A. So over to you.
Thank you, Professor Kodeshwaran. I'm delighted to be speaking in this series. I've been following some of the videos that were posted on YouTube. I've not been able to attend. And it really helped me to kind of think through the care work and how it is associated with precarity, and particularly the precarity of life. So when I try and understand, when I was doing my field work and I was writing my PhD and then later the book, I tried to understand how care work is different from other informal kinds of labor, and what does the idea of precarity or the concept of precarity or the ontological status of precariousness tell us about care work, women's labor, commodified reproductive labor, etc. And one of the things that when I was reading up on historical trends of labor markets, informality, I realized that what we are seeing today is not really new. And labor historians have been telling us, Jan Bremen, anthropologists like Jan Bremen or Rajnarayan Chandravarkar have been writing how even in the heydays of formalization, like the late 20th century, etc., that it was only a small group of workers who were formalized, and not just in retail or trade or services, but say the textile, which was the most formalized industry. And even there, women did not have that kind of a status as other male workers. And so he says that in 1890s, women were probably about a quarter of the industry. And by 1920, they were only about 1/5. And by 1930, they were only 15%. So women's participation in the labor market with formalization was also going down. And that, for me, was very interesting, because when I look at the labor force participation rate in the last 10, 20, 30 years, I also see a decline. And one wonders then, what does this tell us? What are the historical continuities of gender and labor, for instance? So even in the late 20th century, that when women were working, and that is what, say, for 1921 census will tell us that women were mostly found in very assorted kind of casual occupations that fell outside the Factory Act. And interestingly, I found that the largest single census category for female employment was unspecified occupations. So that could be anything. And that was almost 26% of working women. So women were literally picking up work wherever they could, like they were employed as sweepers and scavengers. There was a category called industry of the dress and toilet, and municipal service, running of eatery and hotels, and of course, sex work and domestic work. And that, of course, sex work is very difficult to enumerate, but that is one of the, sex work and domestic work has always generated, two sectors that have generated employment for women. And if you cut to the contemporary, for the last 30 years, we are observing very similar trends. So despite rapid changes in education, declining fertility rates, etc., women's participation in paid work tends to be concentrated in low-paid, unskilled jobs. And so, for example, when I mapped the labor force participation rate, it was 24.1% in 1955, and it started falling rapidly. And at its lowest level in 2017 was 23%. And interestingly, in the last few years, there's been a steady increase. And it was in 2019, it was 30%. In 22-23, it was 37%. And this led to a lot of celebration in the government sector, and the Ministry of Child Welfare set out this press statement saying this is because of the decisive agenda of the government, great policies, initiatives, whether it's large-scale initiatives for girls' education, skill development, and I'm quoting from the press statement, entrepreneurship facilitation, safety in the workplace. All this has led to women's increase in the labor market, or entry into the labor market. But what the statement fails to mention is that the bulk of this increase in the rural areas, almost 80%, was in agriculture. And if you further disaggregate the data, you'll see it is in the casual and the lowest casual occupations of allied agriculture. And in urban areas, it's a wide range of sectors, including manufacturing, related industries, trade, retail, etc. And within manufacturing, it is the garment industry and the tobacco industry that are employing women the most. So for feminists who are working with labor markets, it's always been a question of not of inclusion, but of what kind of jobs are available, what is, and how is gender mediating this access to labor market. And it is generally accepted that women's skill and the recognition of that skill is deeply mediated by gender, but it has been that much harder to argue that it's also been mediated by caste. And if women find their training and skill not recognized in terms of designation, in terms of pay, Dalit women find it impossible to register their labor as skilled work in the modern technology, knowledge-driven political economy. And that's what I would like to kind of focus on to try and understand what is this kinship between gender, caste, and care work and precarity. What does this term precarity bring to us today? What is it tells us new about women's participation in labor force markets? So we know, and particularly with the COVID-19 crisis, that there has been a renewed attention to social reproduction, its role in capitalism, its reorganization in the global north during neoliberalism. Nancy Fraser terms this phenomena as a crisis of care, where she talks about the systematic defunding of resources in the public sector, particularly the reproductive sectors of the economy. And that kind of promotes capital-friendly policies while it simultaneously erodes labor rights. So a lot of people, scholars, have argued that neoliberalism is labor unfriendly regime. And some feminists have argued that it's also life unfriendly regime. And for me, this term, life unfriendly regime, becomes very important because it shows us the mechanisms of exploitation and labor surplus extraction while simultaneously producing this chronic crisis of care. So my talk then kind of specifically tries to focus on how life-sustaining work in a life-unfriendly regime, such as the corporeal-affective care of nursing, is casualized by harnessing caste and gendered notions of labor that has stigma deeply embedded in it. And drawing from my empirical research, I argue that extraction of labor is deeply dependent on the devaluation and non-recognition of the reproductive corporeal labor mostly offered by Dalit women. And as much as this labor is getting commodified with the expansion of the market for care labor, its exploitation does not stop primarily because it is a caste-based labor. So one of the truths, and I think we are all quite well versed about these because there's so much of conversation, particularly during COVID-19, that the fundamental labor of regeneration of life is dependent upon human labor in all its varied productive and reproductive forms. And this foundational labor, whether it's within the household or offered outside the household, is performed by women from marginalized communities. But there are specific ways in which these processes unfold, and it depends on very complex regional social economic histories. And I want to make this point because caste and gender, even in India, plays out differently in different parts of the country. So for instance, in Kerala, the value associated with nursing labor is very different from Bengal, where I focus my research. And what I do is try to examine how gender, caste, and stigma work together in kinship to ensure that commodified, waged reproductive labor continues to be devalued despite a growing market demand for it. So a lot of studies, and most studies on labor processes, particularly that involve women and gendered, we focus on a couple of things. One is the wage differential, one is the labor disciplining and control, and the social construction of the feminine body is intrinsically disposable, replaceable, spendable, etc. But what gets left out of this equation is the deep and intricate relationship between gender and caste when it comes to stigmatized labor. So all of this gets compounded when the labor is deeply stigmatized. And how then differential pricing, disciplining, disposability is deeply tied to the feminine body, particularly if it's a Dalit body. So the processing of labor, the process of laboring, draws from as well as constructs the Dalit woman and her labor as disposable and dispensable. So it just not draws from it, it also actively produces the Dalit woman and her labor as disposable. So in India, for instance, care work accounts for about 10% of female employment, while women comprise 30% of informal wage care workers in health and social work activities. And if you look at the, say in 2021, there was this report published drawing from National Health Workforce Accounts and Periodic Labor Force Survey, where they showed that the unqualified, and this category unqualified is basically skills that are not recognized. This unqualified category, there's 1.4 million such workers in India, which is 56.4% of the whole health workforce. So more than 50% of the health workforce in India is whose skills are not being recognized. And of this further disaggregation will show that 58.4% of nurses and midwives are considered unqualified or not recognized, which kind of tells us a lot about how health and care work is politically organized in this country. So now I turn my attention specifically to the nursing labor market. And one of the peculiarities of nursing labor lies in an internal contradiction. One is, of course, the incredible social and economic mobility that international migration offers. The other contradiction is that it is a caste-based occupation that is deeply stigmatized. So nursing labor, similar to paid domestic work, was offered by women historically located at the margins of Hindu Brahminical society. And partly because, of course, nursing was corporeal labor that included dealing with blood, fluids, and other bodily detritus, looked down upon by caste-based society, and also because it was women's work due to gendered sexual division of labor. And in both pre-colonial and colonial India, the field of gynecology and obstetrics was offered by the Dai, the hereditary midwife, who came from a marginalized community, a low-caste community. And while some argue that the Western trained nurse was intended to replace the Dai, I suggest that that was never a viable project because of the caste class stigma associated with the midwife. In fact, a lot of the emergence of the modernization of the nursing profession was to eliminate the working class untrained women in quotes from gaining employment. So it was along with caste. So there was what we see now in nursing is actually a split where some parts of the labor is considered prestigious and some dirty. So a lot of and this is not specific to India, nursing labor is also deeply stigmatized in varying degrees across the world. And many have said that it's because of the gendered characteristic of nursing labor. Others have pointed to race, ethnicity, where some women are overrepresented in the rungs of nursing care. So what is important to acknowledge, I think, is that care work cannot be replaced by machines. It cannot be, it's interpersonal and it's relational skills. And as it cannot be automated, it continues to be the labor that women keep offering. So one of the capital strategy to reduce labor costs is in the care sector has been to recruit migrant workers from the global south, or in our country, hiring women from marginalized castes and ethnicities to give this corporeal effective hands-on labor. So the care sector is one in which most job profiles, whether that's nurses to elderly carers to daycare teachers, are considered low skill, even though many of them, they're migrant workers or racialized workers in the sector, tend to have higher degrees. So this results in workers being underpaid and employers being able to save on labor costs. How does one maintain these organizational strategies, this continuous exploitation of laborers and this extraction of surplus labor? And that is the fragmentation of the care labor market. So in this particular context, in the context of nursing profession, I would say that the nursing labor is is also de-skilled, drawing from the worker's social identity. So it's already perceived as feminine and stigmatized work. It also sees a split into what is called dirty work and prestigious work. So the dirty work is, of course, taking care of patients' body needs. It becomes the responsibility of women coming from socially marginalized castes and ethnic groups whose devaluation is justified in terms of low wages, bad working conditions, etc. What is the prestigious work? It's mostly the medical, administrative, supervisory role that trained nurses do. It is circumscribed within an elite group of trained nurses who are able to attain institutional degrees, thus gaining economic and social recognition in the labor market. So what I suggest is that the nursing labor market is produced as a pyramidal labor market. That is, the bottom is populated by casually hired women struggling with low wage, stigma, low status, no labor rights or entitlement. And the tip of the pyramid is like a small number of registered nurses who are formally employed and protected by labor laws. So to say that again is to say, but what I really also want to make a point is that nurses really don't have that kind of control over these organizational strategies. But also what I want to say is that a differentiated workforce requires a politics of distinction and differentiation and distancing to be able to, so that for one group of workers to secure better rights at the cost of others. And this differentiated workforce has been deeply studied in various sectors, including weaving and carpentry, etc. So while registered nurses have control over work process that benefit them in an exploitative labor market, their participation and justification in the pyramidal structure emerges from a defense of their social location as respectable women. Because within this very technology-driven medical industry, nurses are already marginalized as semi-professional, semi-skilled women. So she has to struggle to maintain her image as a medical worker. And one of the ways she does it is by distinguishing herself from the low-caste caregiver. And now, this defense of the respectable, that nursing is a respectable labor, that leads to a politics of differentiation and distancing that ties care work to the precarity of life. And that is what is the argument that I make. And the intimate corporeal labor that is required to heal ailing bodies is labor that requires contact with blood, vomit, shit, pus, and other kinds of bodily fluids, which violate body surfaces that keep the notion of self and other intact. It is ritualistically impure labor. And in my book, I discussed in great details of the routine humiliation and shame that women experience in doing this kind of labor. So experiencing humiliation and shame is not just an effect of laboring in a symbolically ritualistic impure occupation, but it also constitutes subjects. Thus, processes of labor and gender articulate with other structures of subordination such as caste to shape the lived experience of work and livelihood, exploitation, and struggle. So I want to kind of bring in some empirical vignette to kind of make my point. So for instance, when I was talking to Parul, who's a Dalit woman who came from one of the villages in Murshidabad district, and she was working in a private nursing home as an attendant. So she came looking for work because, and part of it was also because of the agricultural distress. So there was no work in her village. And she came, and the only work she found was as a nursing aide or an ayah in a nursing home. And she says that she, of course, does not let her family know that she works as a nursing aide in a hospital. So, but she tells me, and I quote her here, that an ayah's work has no respect in society. The nurse looks down on us. No one wants to eat with us or even sit with us. They behave like we are untouchables, and that is because of the work we do. Over the years, I've also learned nursing work, and sometimes because there are not enough nurses around, there's a lot of nursing work that I do, including operating the machines. But we are not respected only because we clean shit and vomit. So denied minimum wages, social security, health insurance, legislative protection, all of that is one part. but the material foundation of caste and gender lie in the control of Dalit women's access to education, occupational mobility, and productive and reproductive labor. So thrust into customary work by economic necessity, the intergenerational imposition of stigmatized occupations on oppressed caste then finds continuity. And I go back to looking at the census, where did these women go? Where did women from marginalized communities go? So this exclusionary impact of caste, class, and gender are implicated not only in the materialized capitalization of gendered reproductive labor, but also in the continuation of discriminative caste, class, and patriarchal ideologies that reproduce social economic exclusion and inequality amongst marginalized women. So, however, as much as we see there's a historical continuity of this feminization of care work, which monetizes their private domestic associations with cleaning and care through caste-based gender occupations in sanitation or domestic work or nursing aid, there's also no denial that the expansion of the commodification of what constitutes the care market, domestic or reproductive labor, further pulls in women from marginalized communities into a ghettoized labor market. So that continuity we continue to see. So this expansion of the care market, fueled by the crisis of care, that is the withdrawal of the neoliberal government from welfare and financialization of critical care sectors, has dovetailed with historical trends of women's employment, particularly those from marginalized race or gender, race or caste and ethnicities. So the Victorian model of domesticity that we learn when we study labor history, premised on the family wage, is replaced by the double income family now. And women increasingly are entering the labor market with low educational attainments and skills that place them in low income, labor intensive and stigmatized occupations like nursing care, sanitation work, and a gamut of other kinds of reproductive domestic services. So we witness a ghettoization of the labor market where only those jobs that cannot be automated and are dependent on affective corporeal labor continues to hire women. It has also rendered marginalized women workers vulnerable across socio-economic, political, and cultural institutions through the denial of social, economic, educational, and occupational mobility, and of course, control over their own labor. So I just want to bring in a little bit more of empirical data to kind of make my point. So particularly the kinship between gender, caste, and stigma. So when I was conducting my fieldwork, and even now, I also noticed that a number of upper caste Brahmin and Brahmin women were working in the lowest rungs of nursing professions. So this shared experience of poverty has led to a gradual erosion of caste codification of the nursing labor. So while Dalit women have not trained in sufficient numbers as nurses, so there was only one Dalit woman in my whole ethnographic study, the fieldwork that I did where I conducted interviews with 100 women, and that too she came in through reservations. But there were a few, numerically insignificant, but a few women who were upper caste and Brahmin women who had taken to working as attendants. And Ritu was one of them. She was 22, she was a Brahmin, and she was working as a attendant Anaya in a private hospital. And she spent a lot of time telling me about her impoverishment of her father, who was a landed farmer, her migration to the city from another district, and how her uncle brought her there, promising her a job as a receptionist, but the only job she got was that of Anaya. But she could not go back home empty-handed without work, so she was compelled, in her words, "I'm compelled to clean shit and vomit now." And I quote her here, she says, "The doctors and sisters here treat us badly. They behave like we have leprosy. They move away from us as if we are untouchables. The way they look at me as if I'm an animal, they don't treat me like I'm a human. I'm a Brahmin and my grandfather was a priest. It's only because we are poor that I have to do this work. And here I'm treated like some low caste just because I'm cleaning dirt and touching fluid and blood." So her anxiety and angst was very sharp. So this loss of caste purity she felt was, she could not stop talking about it. And I was quite puzzled when I was listening to her, and I could not really understand how to frame this loss. And the treatment of this Brahmin woman as a leper, the untouchable, actually, I felt derived from her laboring and coming into contact with ritualistically impure matter. So the upper caste body can only maintain its purity by ritualistic and symbolic practices, and the performance of unclean labor on an everyday basis, where the body comes in contact with waste, refuse, and all that is impure, points to the individual misfortune and inability of the person to maintain caste purity. It's not seen as something structural, but like an individual misfortune. So I argue that the upper caste woman, but impoverished woman, compelled to work in a dirty occupation, is considered what Ambedkar called a walking carrion. Her inherited caste purity is lost. So the ideology of caste, with its deep-rooted material basis in occupational closure, ensures that once an upper caste woman participates in a low caste occupation, she embodies the characteristics of low caste women. So she becomes untouchable to them. Also, one can argue that the antagonistic class divide between privileged formal workers and impoverished, insecure precariat draws from caste-based structures to prevent any kind of collective action between the two segments of workers. So does the entry of upper caste Brahmin women in the lowest end of nursing labor lead to some kind of collective action? And I argue that it is this discrimination is in a way to work against any kind of collective solidarity. So this political, spatial, symbolic violence of untouchability draws its legitimacy and strength by reenacting the historical violence inflicted on the Dalit body in a current modern capitalist organization. So when impure labor is performed by both Dalit and Brahmin women, the practice of untouchability then constitutes newer inequalities by deploying older stratifications to reproduce stigmatized existences. So the body of the woman located at the lowest end of the labor market is not a marginalized static body on which violent acts are being enacted, but it's brought into being by an affective economy of humiliation and shaming. So it's not like a static body on which violence is being done. It's also brought into being how an upper caste woman is now being made to feel like a Dalit woman. To make sense of this violence that surrounds the body of this woman compelled to labor in a caste-based occupation is to understand how borders are created and sustained, and how are borders reinforced in an environment where the very fluidity and slippery nature of tasks allocated unsettle borders and brings it to a crisis. So it's kind of a little difficult to understand who is a nurse and who is a nursing attendant, right? A lot of the work overlaps. So a lot of the contact zone then becomes a site of great violence. So the survival and reinforcement of boundaries depend on deep symbolic and ritualistic violence that is embedded in these contact zones. So, and feminist economists have argued in the context of gender that work segregated as women's work was devalued and denigrated in modern factory spaces. But when men started taking these jobs, the wages started going up. It was perceived as skilled labor, leading to a hike in wages, improved working conditions. But in the case of nursing labor, where the workforce continues to be feminized, when upper caste women performing labor segregated for Dalit women, when they enter this occupation, why does it not revalorize the labor? Why do wages not go up? Why do working conditions not improve? On the contrary, they descend to the bottom of the caste hierarchy. So instead of asking if the caste-based division of labor is more pervasive than the gender-based division of labor, I argue that commodification and exploitation of women's reproductive or care labor cannot be fully comprehended by the category of informality and occupational mobility, but rather through the lens of a stigma associated with traditional feminine caste-based occupation. And that is where stigma becomes so important. I want to end now, but I would like to kind of dwell a little bit on why care work is better understood through the lens of precarity rather than informality. And precarity is often used to describe the late 20th century transformation of work from stable full-time jobs towards flexible labor regimes, commonly identifies as a shift from Fordism to post-Fordism. There's also been a lot of critique of this idea, saying there's never really been a kind of perfect Fordist economy. There's always been like women, minority, racial, and ethnic who've been left out. And the anxiety, insecurity, and feelings of unbelonging that comes with this post-Fordist thing has always been there and has been the experience of certain workers who've always been invisibilized in understanding labor relations. Precarity also became a buzzword, particularly after Euro May Day in 2001, when there was this anti-precarity movement and to protest the lack of stable jobs, affordable housing, social welfare provisions. So this campaign gave voice to what some considered an emergent political subject, namely those whose social relationships to capital or the state was not determined by wage labor alone, but by their exclusion from steady jobs and the citizen worker. So that also became how precarity now would become a collective action. But the debate between Guy Standing and Jan Bramman over the term precariat to understand whether it mobilizes collective action or deeply fragment workers is very instructive in that sense. And I agree with Bramman that precariousness has indeed diminished the collective power of working classes. However, I would like to draw from feminist insights to make this claim that care work adds to the precarity of life far more than any other informal labor. Because if we frame precarity as an ontological condition, precariousness or precarity focuses attention on social marginality and vulnerability. So Judith Butler, we all know, famously talked about precariousness. She discussed the livability of lives, defines precarity as a condition experienced by the marginalized poor and disenfranchised people who are exposed to economic insecurity, injury, violence, and forced migration. Further, social values ascribed to some lives and bodies while it is denied to others, and some are protected while others are not. So social and political organizations and other institutions have developed in context of power to maximize precariousness for some and minimize it for others. So meaning that while all life is equally defined by precariousness because we are all vulnerable, it does not follow that all lives are equally precarious. So those engaged in hands-on caring labor lead far more precarious lives than those whose works are as nurses in recognized jobs. The stigma associated with corporeal labor and the stigma associated with being a hospital worker that treats women as untouchable spills over to other areas of their lives, including access to social security, health, housing, and other reproductive rights. So I end here saying that the everyday of the working life of care workers cannot be comprehended just through the lens of their relation with waged work, but rather in context to poverty, political disempowerment, and violence. Thank you. No, did I do well with time?
Very well. Thank you. Thank you so much, Panchali. That was really very thought-provoking talk and lots of questions. But here we go. Anjali, so why don't you unmute and pose your question? Thanks.
Hi, am I audible? Yeah. So thank you. Wonderful talk. I just wanted to clarify something on the methodology part. I'm also a PhD candidate and I recently started my field work. So I wanted to ask you, how did you engage with the workers on the caste issue? Because in my field work, I am finding this rather reluctance in workers to engage with their caste identities. So what were your, you know, your approach towards the caste question so that the workers are, more comfortable to reveal their, because I feel that because I am situated in an urban background, so they might feel that since now they have migrated from rural to urban, so ye caste ka angle maybe hat jaye, so that their identities can rise up above the caste thing. So I just wanted to ask, how did you manage to engage with their identities, especially on the caste? Thank you.
Should I? Thanks. Actually, when I went to the field, caste was not central to my concerns. And, in Bengal, we have this denial of caste. And there's, so when I went to the field, I knew caste would, but the fact that it played up so significantly, it's what took me by surprise. And I had to go back and rethink my research questions because, I did not see a reluctance on their part to discuss caste. I'm not sure why you are facing it, but I trying to think through what probably led them to speak so eloquently on the caste angle is, I think primarily it was the loss of caste status that really, and the stigma associated with it. And how I connected that to caste was primarily they would keep saying that, you know, they treat us like untouchable, they treat us like untouchable. So it is this angst or the anguish of losing caste by working in a corporeal labor sector that is so deeply stigmatized that framed almost every interaction. In fact, the caste question was the most vivid question in my research, in my ethnographic studies. So it really did not require much prodding from my side, because I felt that they were deeply relieved to have someone ready to listen to what is almost invisibilized and normalized, right? So in that sense, I felt that if I asked other questions, they would like, no, please listen to what we have to say, which is how we are treated, and how the hospital treats us, how doctors treat us, how administrators treat us. So I'm not sure why you're facing so much of a problem, but probably it could be, I don't know which field you're working in and what category of workers you're working with. So it could be a difference in that as well.
Thank you. It makes sense.
Yeah, go ahead, Natalie.
Hiya, thank you. This was really fascinating. I just wanted to ask you to expand more on something you mentioned briefly towards the beginning, which was that about the regional variation, and that in Kerala that the value associated with nursing labour is very different. I'm sort of guessing that it's maybe higher, but I wondered if you could say more about that and why that is. And then also whether your research, so I research domestic work, and I know that in that sort of internal migration, including between different states, is quite a major issue. I was wondering if that came up in your research as well, and whether that had any impacts in addition to or alongside kind of caste and class. Thank you.
Yes, so I think I made that a point because a lot of times when I try to talk about nursing labor and stigmatization of this labor, and I get a lot of pushback saying, oh, but look at Kerala and how everybody's becoming a nurse. And it's so it also kind of, I thought that the regional variations need to be kind of foregrounded here. Also because in my research, just not Kerala, women from Jharkhand, Manipur, Orissa, Nagaland, nursing is a very lucrative profession, and this has a lot to do with migration to the Gulf countries, and that there are channels of migration that are there. Whereas in Bengal, the international migration is far lower. If you see, Bengal in that sense has not had a flight of nurses going to the West or to the Gulf countries. So a lot of women, particularly from Jharkhand, would tell me that in our village, there is a nurse in every house. So the church and the state comes together to give loans or to sponsor girls' education in nursing, and they also they can ask for a bride price. That's what I was told. That as a nurse, when I get a job and when I go abroad, my value in the marriage market goes up. Whereas in Bengal, being a nurse goes against you in terms of whether it's in the marriage market, and I think it has a lot to do with international migration. And in the southern states particularly, the channels of migration are well laid out. It's institutionalized. There are private companies that recruit and send women abroad for their nursing jobs, etc. So I think there's also a history that goes behind how regional politics have played out in terms of corporeal labor, in terms of nursing labor and its value. As far as migration between states have got, I saw a lot of migration within the state. So Bengal is quite diverse, and southern Bengal is very poor. Northern Bengal is also there's a crisis there. The tea companies, the tea gardens are shutting down, etc. So there's a tremendous amount of internal migration between Bengal, and actually most of the attendants that I I spoke to, most of the ayahs that I spoke to, none of them were really from Calcutta. They were all from villages and from faraway districts, and they are coming because there's a crisis in agriculture, because their families can no longer afford them, and they're sent to the city to work. So they're single women migrating to the city from other districts, from poorer districts around. So I did see some women coming from the Northeast and from Kerala to work in the corporate sector hospital that I did my field work in, but that was also just to gain experience to be able to go abroad. So after their training, they spent 2-3 years gaining experience. So that was like a temporary migration, mostly placements done through their nursing schools.
I think there's a question in the chat from Hitesh. Ah, okay. And also, I think a question from Udita. So maybe Udita, you can take both questions probably. So Udita, you can go ahead.
Hi, thank you for the very insightful session. My question is, I was reading on, I work on menstruation and I'm a second-year doctoral researcher. I read up on this article by Deepti Sukumar where the article is titled "Caste is my period." So I would like to know your thoughts on, whether menstruation affects or, kind of shapes the employment of the nurses in Bengal.
I'm sorry, just to understand better, are you asking that do women's reproductive bodies come in the way of their employment as nurses?
Yes, and considering that, the whole politics around untouchability, so does menstruation add to that marginalization? And, is it a kind of double marginalization the women face?
So I've really not had much conversation around the question of menstruation and how that adds to the marginalization of women in the labor market in the nursing sector. So also to say, in Bengal, menstruation is not so much of a taboo as it is in, say, southern parts of the country or certain communities in other parts of the country. Whether women's reproductive labor, whether women's reproductive capabilities come in the way of their employment as nurses, I would say not so much, because these jobs, so the first is they do not, apart from the government employed nurses, they do not have leave entitlements, they do not have access to health and social security, they do not, so if they conceive and if they want maternity leave, they do not get it, they're asked to leave. A lot of these women are also on casually employed, that is a daily waged employment. They come, they work for 12 hours, they get a certain salary, a certain wage for the day. They don't have leave. If they don't show up, they don't earn. So in that sense, if they're as women, if they're going through menstruation, if they are pregnant, if they're going through childbirth, or lactation, they just drop out of the labor force. It's not even taken into consideration. So if you don't show up for work, you're gone, and you can always come back after 2-3 months if you want to employ. So a lot of times, which is why a lot of the lower strata of this pyramid is a distress sale of labor. Women who have lost their husbands and have children and don't know how to provide for their families, who join in as nursing ayahs or as nursing aides or maternity ward assistants, primarily because it is seen as a no-skilled labor, right? So every woman can offer this work. It is part of their maternal corporeal labor that they just bring to the marketplace. But to address your question, because they have no reproductive rights in the labor market, therefore these questions never come up. It's completely invisibilized, whether it's menstrual leave or whether it's maternity leave, or it doesn't figure. So either you show up for work or you don't show up for work. I'm just reading the chat. Yeah, a very similar question. Where nurses own social reproduction at their own households. So this is particularly the crisis of care that that a lot of scholars are talking about in very similar way of the global north and south, and how the domestic and the global north is being reproduced by women from marginalized communities and ethnic and racial backgrounds from the global south, and the whole reproductive labor and the international division of reproductive labor literally brought this foregrounded this about how there's a crisis of care within the caregiver's own home. And and that is partly what I think, if you look at even within southern countries or even in India, women who are entering the labor market as caregivers, what happens to their domestic? What is the crisis of care there? So as the government, in the neoliberal government, withdraws from the reproductive sector and defunds, whether it's childcare, whether it's social security, whether it's right to housing, healthcare, all of these come into, these issues become far and far more important. How does the caregiver then negotiate as she provides care in the market? What happens to her own family? What happens to her own reproductive rights? And there is a complete silence on that, right? And this is the crisis of care that we are talking about. The withdrawal of government from almost all the social sectors, including reproductive rights, in one way leads to women entering the labor market in a distressed sale of labor with depressed wages that do not provide enough to be able to purchase care for their own families, and with the government. And that is the precarity of life that I'm trying to connect with care work. So with the withdrawal of the government, that basically means the working class loses all reproductive rights. As much as they are the ones who are entering the labor market to meet the reproductive demands of a certain population, they themselves are losing reproductive rights.
Great. Akanksha, you can go ahead.
Thank you, ma'am, for the opportunity. Ma'am, that was a great talk. Thank you so much for your insights. I have a question regarding a point you made about the loss of caste purity when you were talking about Brahmin nurse that you met. So that was an interesting point, and I want to know more about how the bodily purity is maintained by ritualistic behavior. And by ritualistic behavior, do you mean engaging more in the religious aspects? And also, are these women coming from rural or urban area? Because I'm trying to understand their mindset behind it. If you can respond or elaborate more on that. Thank you.
So when I was talking about ritualistic and symbolic practices, what I was trying to, I was drawing on other scholars who talked about how caste purity is maintained by the kind of everyday ritual and symbolic practices that maintain caste purity. And when women enter into caste-based occupation, they lose that purity because they can no longer distance themselves from certain impure activities, certain impure labor, right? Cleaning, shit, and vomit, in their words, makes them lose their caste status. And there is no way that they can then regain that caste status by going home and doing certain rituals, because as far as they're concerned, their participation in this strata of labor, their participation as an ayah, cleaning shit, has taken away their caste purity, and that cannot be regained any further. So saying which, these women, and whether their social and economic location is primarily, at least in my field work, were from the rural sector. They were mostly came from small agricultural landholding families who were not being able to make ends meet. So these women had also probably finished their schooling. Some of them did have a halfway through college degree. They did not finish it, or they just finished it, but they came to the city looking for work to support their families, their natal families. Some of them were married and were distressed because their husbands had left them or were not financially capable at that point. They had children. So there were various reasons. There was why they had come to the city looking for work. None of them came looking for work as a nursing attendant. None of them came looking for work as an ayah. They came through certain networks, certain contacts. They came to be hospital receptionists because they thought with their school education or their nurse or their college degree, they would get some kind of what they called office job. That's what they were looking for. But when they found that that is the only work that was available, it was not possible for them to go back home empty-handed. So they entered the labor force and they worked as an ayah, but at home they would say they're doing office work in an hospital, right? So that is the way probably they were trying not to lose status in their natal or their marital homes in the village. But within that sector, in that city, in that profession, they were unable to maintain caste purity. And it is what does it do to one's subjectivity, and how does one respond to labor market processes when one is treated as an untouchable? So whereas Dalit women also experienced this, I particularly took the example of Ritu, who was very articulate about this loss, to argue that how does stigmatized labor tie to the precarity of life, tie to the vulnerability of life? How does this sense of loss of caste purity, how does the sense of loss of being treated as an untouchable because you are associated or you're performing stigmatized labor lead to a precariousness, a vulnerability, a sense of loss, a sense of entitlement, that a worker should feel, a collective solidarity, a consciousness of being a worker in a capitalist economy, that sense of self, that I'm a worker, and to form a collective, that itself is missing when one is treated, or one is shamed and humiliated in this way in a workplace. And that is the point that I was trying to make here. And why I felt that precarity is probably more useful in trying to understand women's experiences in a stigmatized labor rather than just informality, which could be anything. It could be a peon, it could be a clerk, it could be a pharmaceutical guy, anyone. But precarity and that loss of self and that loss of that consciousness of being a worker, that vulnerability that comes with it, is closely tied to care work that is stigmatized.
Thank you, ma'am.
I think while we wait, maybe I just had a question for you about, not all forms of paid reproductive labor are similar, obviously. And I'm thinking here about, anything that involves some degree of sexuality is precarious in a different way, because in terms of economic returns, it's invariably much higher than what a woman, could, with that educational status, could get in comparable labor markets. So it, a sex worker or a dancer would, be precarious in many ways, but economically might be better off than, some of the women. So I'm just curious about at what point does, and the boundary work argument is very interesting, obviously, right? At what point do you breach the boundary enough for it to translate into economic rewards, right? Into where it's so stigmatized that it becomes economically attracts more compensation in the market than other forms of precarious, very similar stigmatized kind of work. And yeah, I mean, we've seen this even with surrogates and egg donors and many categories. So it's not just purely selling sexual services, but something. So can we really tease out what it is that drives you to the other side, where in fact your monetary compensation is much higher, but you continue to be precarious on many other registers, in terms of, harassment from the state or whatever it is. So just curious about what you think.
So, I mean, it's a very interesting question, and it's very thought-provoking too, because a lot of nurses are also considered sex workers in the sense that, they do struggle with the stigma of a sex worker. And I do feel there's a continuum there between the nurse, domestic worker, and sex worker, and how one slides from one to the other. Then relationships in the hospital itself with the better off male patients, doctors, and the romances that happen there, and which is a commercial transaction and which is a romantic transaction. All of this kind of plays and around, and of course night shift. I mean, leaving the hospital at 5 in the morning when your night shift is over, taking the train back to your home. So what a lot of women would often tell me is that, what do you think our village, the men in our village think when they see us coming back at 5 in the morning from the city in the morning train? So it is a shared stigma that nurses, particularly the ones located at the lower end, that they share, the domestic workers, nursing aides, sex workers. I would plot them in the same continuum. And I find nobody's really told me, and to be very honest, nobody's really told me in very clear terms that I don't have any interview where they talk about this shifting between domestic work, nursing work, in the higher work, the lower end, and sex work. But the sense that I got that these boundaries were very fuzzy in many ways. Of course, one part is the stigma that is there and the politics of differentiation that trained nurses at the top do when they say that, oh, these women are all, they are all sex workers, they moonlight as sex workers and as nursing aides. And, this is why nursing is so stigmatized, because of the active presence of women like that. In fact, if you see the history of nursing, even in the West, they mostly came from monasteries, the nuns and sisters, and as well as those who were already sex workers who kind of moonlighted as also nursing aides. So it's women's commodified labor, reproductive labor, I think operates in a continuum, and very difficult to be able to mark one out. And I think the economic benefits that the stigma is in varying degree there, but the economic benefits that you talk about also, I think, varies. So I wouldn't be surprised if women who work as nursing aides, as ayahs, also work as dancers, also work as sex workers, and in different stages of their life choose one over the other.
Thank you. That's very useful. Any other questions? Checking. Okay. I think that's so if no one else has any other questions, I think I will invite you to offer any final thoughts, Panchali, and to thank you for your wonderful presentation.
No, thank you for inviting me. I really enjoyed, putting the thoughts together, because I'm really pushing the idea of precarity as opposed to informality to understand care work. I think I've spoken enough. I don't think